All right. So this morning we are going to be talking about civil magistrates. Who? And there's the QR code if anybody wants to go ahead and scan that. You can look up the confession on your mobile device. I believe we have handouts that'll be passed around momentarily for anybody who wants those as well. All right, so last week, Dave led a great lesson on chapter 22 on oaths and vows. And this week, as I said, we will be talking about civil magistrate. So similar to last week, you might be curious why a confession of faith has a chapter dedicated to the civil magistrate. You know, what on earth does the government have to do with our faith, and specifically a confession of our faith? And magistrate, you know, is really just a fancy word for government specifically. But let me ask you this, and maybe this will help frame everything for the rest of today. So what is the basis of authority that the civil government has? Where do they get their authority from? Think about that. So where is the government's authority come from? From God, obviously. And you wouldn't think that, you know, this is going to be in any way controversial because, you know, the government's boring. But actually, there's definitely some stuff about the lesson today that I think is going to be controversial. You know, might be a little uncomfortable as we talk about it. But I think it's important that we bring these things to the front and really discuss them and talk about them as just a way of understanding what it is that we truly confess to believe. So before we get into the details of chapter 23, I want to talk about some biblical names / titles for God. And this isn't Mike just going off on another one of his tangents. There's actually a reason that we're setting this up. And I lost the slides. There we go. Weird. All right, so the first is Lord. Lord comes from the Hebrew Adonai, and it refers to one who is absolutely sovereign. So it can have both civil and biblical connotations to it. The second is Lord. Note all caps in that. Sometimes you'll see it with the small caps. Sometimes you'll see it fully capitalized. Anytime you see that in the Bible, it's referring to the proper name of God. The Hebrew letters there for Yod, He, Wa, and He, which are translated or transliterated to Yahweh or Jehovah or Jehovah. And we're not going to get into all the scholarly theories that go about how those translations and transliterations came, but just important to note that those two lords are different. And then the last is king. That comes from the Hebrew word melech, and it has a political connotation of a ruler. So David as king was melech. He was also Adonai because he was sovereign, put in place over the kingdom of Israel. So Psalm 110 verse 1, very, very often quoted. I think it is actually the most frequently quoted or alluded to passage in the New Testament from the Old Testament, 24 times to be specific. And you may not get this from just reading the Psalm, but it really outlines what is the story of redemption, with Christ elevated to king priest at the center. So the Lord, Yahweh, says to my Lord, Adonai, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. And it's important to note that this is a psalm from David. So David, as Melech, king, is saying, the Lord in heaven is saying to my Lord. Now, if David is speaking to someone who's above him, but he's talking about God speaking to that person, you know, we're in that way referring to Christ in that role, right? And it's just to understand that there is, one, a hierarchy, two, there is both civil and biblical roles that we're talking about here, and three, that Christ is essentially named as the king priest in this. the other thing to take note from that psalm, or that we can get from that psalm, is that not only is Jesus at the center of this and at the center of our redemption and the redemption story, but there's absolutely a political connotation. This is putting Jesus in a political office, and as such, it's important to understand that God's kingdom is not a democracy or a constitutional republic. It is an absolute monarchy, where Jesus as king is absolute and above all. All right, so some scripture. Romans 13, verses 1 through 4. This is a proof text for much of this chapter. There's only 4 sections in the chapter, and you'll see parts or all of this listed in the proof text. So, as we read through this, it's important to understand that this is really where a lot of this chapter of the confession kind of gets its authority, and I'll read it out. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. So, what do we get from this passage? I mean, there's a lot there to unpack, certainly. What are some thoughts? What are you guys getting as you read this passage from Romans? Well, I think first, we are to be subject to the governing authorities, right? I think that's primary, and I think it's important to also draw from this that all of the authority comes from God, right? So God is essentially granting his or the authority to govern from him, and he is placing these civil magistrates, these governments, over us through his authority and the authority that he grants to them. And I think it's also to understand that for us, resisting that authority equates to resisting God. And that certainly may sound difficult. If I don't agree with the government and I resist them, is that really resisting God? Like, gosh, that seems harsh, doesn't it? But, I mean, that's, when we look at this passage, it's pretty clear that that's what it's saying. The other thing is that the authorities bear the sword, and they're carrying out God's wrath. Another reality that might be a little difficult to wrap your head around and really understand. Like, God is actually giving the government the authority to carry out his wrath? I thought vengeance is mine, says the Lord. But no, he's granting the government the authority to do that on his behalf. The other thing to get from this is to put this in context, right? So Paul is writing this to the church in Rome, who at the time when he's writing this is under the authority, or the terror maybe is a better word, of Nero. Nero was an absolute tyrant, if you know anything about history. Many people think he was actually insane. But, they say Nero fiddled while Rome burned. And the church was hardly persecuted by Nero. And so Paul is writing this to these people who are under this tremendous persecution by the emperor of Rome, and telling them, no, this person is over you because God has placed them there, and you must obey the civil authority that they've been granted. So yeah, just a few things to highlight there. All right, so, yes, Tony. Yes. Yeah, so that's an important part. Yeah, so right. To carry out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. The last part of that. So it's important to note, like, the confession of the Bible is not giving ultimate or supreme authority to the government to bear the sword on whomever they feel. No, their role is to bear the sword on those who deserve it. let's think about that for a minute. Like, why might that happen? And we'll go specifically to the section of the confession right now. So, why would this specific confession, why would that passage in Romans talk about granting authority or granting the power of the sword to the government and not to individuals? Any thoughts? So why would God not say to us, you've been wronged, you may avenge this wrong by yourself? Go ahead, Harry.
Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. That's God's job, not ours.
Yeah, right. It's God's job, it's not ours. So God is able to, by his own will, determine the authority that he grants to different entities, right? So, we've gone through Romans, and that really is the context that sets up section 1 of chapter 23. So God, the supreme Lord and King of all the world, hath ordained civil magistrates, governments, to be under him over the people for his own glory and the public good. And to this end hath armed them with the power of the sword for the defense and encouragement of them that are good, and for the punishment of evildoers. So, right, God's elevating the government above us for, I think, two important things to get here. For three important things. For his glory, for the public good, and the punishment of evildoers. And so, really what we're doing in this is first we're affirming that God is supreme in his lordship and kingship over the world, right? So if God were not supreme, he wouldn't be able to grant this authority to the governments to be over us. But, if God is granting authority to these civil governments, I mentioned Nero a moment ago. Let's think of some evil rulers in the 20th century, right? We can think of Stalin, Mao, Hitler. It's a little tough to reconcile this notion, isn't it? It kind of stings. Like God is granting the authority of these people over these governments. They're ruling, because of God's sovereignty. But we can also look back to the Old Testament and see that the same thing happened. We can think of Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, right? God used these evil kings in history to chasten the Israelites, right? To basically help them to see the error of their ways, one, fulfilling his prophecy and promises, but also proving his sovereignty. But it's also important to understand that, while God grants these people authority and puts them in place over us, he's not sanctioning their evil deeds, right? He's not sanctioning their wrongdoing. It certainly may work to God's purpose. We see Pharaoh and the Israelites in Egypt, certainly that worked to God's purpose. That doesn't mean that God sanctioned the evil that Pharaoh was doing to the Israelites, or sanctions the evil that Hitler or Mao or Nebuchadnezzar did to the people that were under them. But, one thing we get from this is that, government in its most basic form is ultimately legal force. That's really what Section 1 is telling us. When you boil it down, in the most basic form, government is legal force. And there's good precedent for thinking that, right? When we go back to Genesis and we think of the very first earthly government that was put in place, think about Eden. And this may sound a little confusing, but the first thing that God did when Adam and Eve were placed out of Eden, he puts an angel there with a flaming sword to prevent them from getting in, right? So, force. And that really is the first established method of government that we can look to. And again, through God's authority, his sovereignty, that angel was there to essentially be the law and to do it with force if necessary. In the Westminster Ch Catechism, sin is defined as any want of conformity unto or transgression of the law of God. So, the other thing that we can get from this, it's important to note the word law in that. without law, there cannot be sin. So it's required for us to understand what sin is. We need to understand the law and what the law prevents or prohibits. And it's the need for the law that derives the need for government. So if we didn't require law, we really wouldn't have a requirement for government. Government again being legal force. So why does the government, though, to your question earlier, Tony, why does the government have the role to punish evildoers? Certainly, we know that God has the authority to grant them that. But let's try to unpack that a little bit and think, what is it? What is the reason behind the government having that authority and not individuals? Any thoughts? You guys are a quiet bunch today. Protect society, yeah. I mean, and ultimately, right, human nature is not to get even. We want vengeance. We want to get the one up. That is the core of our sinful human nature. It's not in the nature of humans to be able to get vengeance in a truly biblical manner. We always want to get one up, and we always want to better somebody else. And it's because of this that God places government under him, under God's rule and his sovereignty, to be over the people. But, the interesting, question? Go ahead.
I was going to say that God is a just God, and he has provided a mechanism for justice to be brought to bear on the sinner.
Yeah, absolutely, Graham. Absolutely. Our culture is unique in that, today we're talking about God being over the government. It's not uncommon in American culture, and I think Josh kind of touched on this in his sermon today. We want to understand government to be over the people, but independent of God, right? With the way that our country's gone so secular in the late 20th century and 21st century, we certainly are okay with government being over the people, but somehow we think that government can be over the people and independent of God. And I don't think that those two things can be rationalized. Personally, I don't think so. But so, that kind of breaks down why the government has the role to punish evildoers. But let's talk about why we have to obey the civil magistrate. What is it that requires us to obey the civil magistrate? The public good. I mean, I think first because if we truly understand what the confession is saying and what that passage in Romans is saying, it is God's will that they are over us. And so to not obey the civil magistrate is not to obey God's will. I think more importantly, though, we do it to honor Christ. And I'm going to show a picture here in a second, but when we think about when we think about the role of where this hierarchy of the universe sits, Christ as king, by honoring the government, we are honoring Christ, who is king over that government, right? And as Graham said, government does exist for the public good. So, when we look at the American system of checks and balances, when it was created, it was completely unique in the world, the fact that you would have these different branches of government that existed to ensure, at the time anyway, or the thought was that there would not be the ability to lord over the people in an evil way, because the government was supposed to have these checks and balances on itself. And, without government, what would the result be, honestly? Like chaos, anarchy, lawlessness, right? So certainly there is a role for government to play, and if we can reconcile the fact that God has placed the government over us, and reconcile that it is honoring Christ by listening to and following the government or the magistrate, then I think that certainly helps. So, like I said, the hierarchy of the universe, right? We've got heaven, we've got earth, and this is just a quick picture to explain what I just spoke about. But God, the Almighty Father, above everything, Just below him, sitting at his right hand, is Christ the Redeemer, who has been granted total authority over heaven and earth, which means he has authority over those civil magistrates, who then have authority over the governed. But again, Christ's authority is supreme over all of that. Make sense? All right. So how does this relate to Christians, though? Got a few Bible verses there. No need to look at them specifically. But basically, you know, we can look back at what happened in the Bible and try to draw from that what the relationship of government to Christians should be. So we can see in Genesis, Joseph was made ruler over all of Egypt by Pharaoh, as obviously not a Christian, but somebody who was faithful to God. Daniel was made ruler over Babylon. And in Acts 10, Cornelius, who was a Roman centurion, is noted to have feared God and to pray to him. So if we move on to section 2, you know, how do we get that relates to us as Christians? And I'll read section 2 out here. So it is lawful for Christians to accept and execute the office of a magistrate when called thereunto, and the managing whereof, as they ought especially to maintain piety, justice, and peace, according to the wholesome laws of each commonwealth. So for that end, they may lawfully, now under the New Testament, wage war upon just and necessary occasion. So the first part of this section is probably something that we take for granted. You know, it's not uncommon, I should say, for Christians to serve in the government. I know a number of people who are working government jobs or have worked for the government. You know, we know of Christians who've been placed into elected office, right? So that part probably doesn't seem very controversial or of anything that raises an eyebrow. But what I do want to draw your attention to is this last part. So Christians may lawfully, now under the New Testament, wage war upon just and necessary occasion. So for this part, we specifically need to go back and kind of understand the Reformation in the 16th century and the climate when the Confession was written in the 17th century. During that time, there was a tremendous amount of debate going on as to what the roles of the church and the state were and how the two were meant to work within each other. And there were three primary views that were considered. So the first is called the unity of church and state. And in that, the church is subsumed under the state or vice versa. And you can think of Old Testament theocracies, or even the way that, honestly, the Vatican City exists today. So it doesn't mean that there isn't a separation of labor. So, you know, you can have people in those environments where the people doing the civil labor are different than the people doing the religious labor. You know, just like in Israel, the high priests were not the same people who were out collecting taxes, for example, right? But the church and the state are in unity. They are one. There is the separation of church and state, which was typically in the Anabaptist reformers, because of the corruption that they saw in the Roman Catholic Church, felt that there had to be total separation between church and state, because any role in civil government could compromise the commitment to Christ. So the idea being that unless you have complete separation between the church and the state, and the two are never the twain shall meet, you will have corruption on the civil side, leading people away from being faithful to Christ. That's the Anabaptist view of this. And then there's the more common Reformed view called the two kingdoms or two spheres. This really comes from Augustine, and it's the idea that there's the kingdom of the government and the kingdom of the church. They are both ordained by God. And this also goes back to the very strong concept of vocation that was happening throughout the Reformation. So, you know, a lot of what the reformers believed is that we are called to vocations, and these vocations, whether they be in the church or not, are brought to us by God. So it's God calling us to use the gifts that he has given us to fulfill his purposes. And those purposes can be in a civil government, they can be in a church. Regardless, they are from God. And while our vocation may not be necessarily in the church, our vocation is still something that God is calling us to do. So does that kind of make sense, those three separate ideas? So you have the unity of the church and the state, you have the separation of church and state, and then the two spheres or the two kingdoms where there are two separate things, but both are fully ordained by God. And you know, for the two kingdoms idea, we can really think of it as our work being a form of worship. You know, Judd and Jan Lemos, with their work with the 1826 network, are really trying to extrapolate on this, right? They're basically calling people to the mission field through their vocation of work. So there's clearly a biblical precedent for that. But I digress. Let's really get into the war part of it. So there's two kind of views that played into this part of the confession, and that we really have to think about when we're doing it. So the first is the Anabaptist view, which is total pacifism, no matter the cost. So the Anabaptists were completely pacifists in their view. They did not believe that there was any point in time where a Christian should be involved in war, shouldn't serve in the military, any of that. Then there's the Augustinian view, which was later worked on by Aquinas, called the just war theory, which is that Christians are not only permitted, but obligated to take up the sword under certain conditions. So the two are quite different. One saying you may not, and the other saying, nope, there's times where you are actually obligated to take up the sword and to go to war. And you know, the line about waging war in the confession is specifically aimed at the Anabaptists, saying that no, there is times when it is necessary for Christians to take up the sword, and those times certainly would be, you know, when God's laws are being broken. And the reason for that is because government is armed with the power of the sword, and so if we are to take up the sword, it should be under the umbrella of the government authority, not just doing it willy-nilly on our own. The other thing, too, is when we go back to the Old Testament, we can look and see that, you know, there's clear precedent for drawing this line out. God actually rebuked the civil magistrate when they failed to punish or execute criminals of capital crimes, right? You know, the Old Testament is full of capital punishment. There were a whole lot of offenses that could get you killed, and there are many times in the Bible where God is rebuking the government for not carrying out those executions that he deemed lawful and necessary. And God also called his people to war many, many times as a way of fulfilling his promises. I mean, how many times throughout you know, the Old Testament, specifically the first 5 books, do we see the Israelites going to war with God leading them to war? So clearly there is biblical precedent and justification for war and honestly justified killing. And a lot of this, you know, where this can get controversial, if we try to take this and apply it to today, something like the death penalty, you know, it's a controversial topic these days, but if we are to look at the confession and look at Scripture, clearly there is a role for government to play in killing evildoers and wrongdoers. Whether that sits well with you or not, that's frankly what we are to draw from Scriptures and specifically from this piece of the confession. But, you know, also notice that when we go back to section 1, the power of the sword, as Graham had said, is for the defense and encouragement under the people, for the people under the government's rule, right? So the power of the sword is not to go out and wage wars. It is to provide for the defense of the people that the government has been placed over to protect. And that's really where the just war theory comes into play. So the just war theory doesn't mean that any country can just go in and invade another. You know, we can look to the headlines today and see what's happening in Eastern Europe with Russia and Ukraine. I think that any objective person will be able to look at that and say, there's nothing just about what is happening in that environment. But you know, when we look to things like World War II, for example, and I'm not trying to give a history lesson or claim that I have the answers, but just to get you to think about it, you know, with what Hitler was doing with the Jews and killing so many, not just Jews, Christians, everybody. I mean, he was an all-purpose killer. There were many people who would say, you know, the American involvement to stop Hitler could be considered a just war. Again, I'm not saying it was or it wasn't, but just to provide the background as to why we may find that it's necessary to even go to war, to use the power of the sword to prevent evil. But I mean, war is a complicated thing, right? So let's go back to the American Revolution, for example, and specifically in relation to this chapter of the Confession. There were many Christians during the American Revolution who felt that because God had placed the English government over them, it was wrong for them to rebel against the English government. And then you had other people saying, no, the English government is doing evil to us. It is our duty to rebel against the English government, right? So you can kind of see where the conflict arises. The American Civil War, another great example, right? And again, not trying to get into a history lesson, but there were staunch Christians on both sides of that conflict. There were Christians in the South who believed that the North were the aggressors because the South was trying to secede or break a contract that they felt that they were lawfully able to do. And Abraham Lincoln used the Bible as his justification, saying they are enslaving people who should be free. And Lincoln's justification for the Emancipation Proclamation was completely biblical, saying that it is wrong for the South to be enslaving these people, and thus we must prevent that evil, right? So you know, war is very complicated. I certainly don't have the answers, but just to kind of give you some of the things that went into why this chapter of the Confession, this specific section, is what it is. All right, but how do the people serving in the government relate to the church? I've got a few Bible verses up here. I will quickly read through them. So 2 Chronicles 26:18, these are all ESV. And they withstood King Uzziah and said to him, "It is not for you, Uzziah, to burn incense to the Lord, but for the priests, the sons of Aaron, who are consecrated to burn incense. Go out of the sanctuary, for you have done wrong, and it will bring you no honor from the Lord God." 1 Corinthians 12:28-29. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, helping, administrating, and various kinds of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? And then Isaiah 49, verse 23. Kings shall be your foster fathers, and their queens your nursing mothers. With their faces to the ground, they shall bow down to you and lick the dust of your feet. Then you will know that I am the Lord. Those who wait for me shall not be put to shame. So these are some of the proof texts that we find for section 3 of chapter 23. And I think clearly these proof texts are pointing to what we would probably call a separation of church and state. So section 23 starts out with, civil magistrates may not assume to themselves the administration of the word and sacraments or the power of the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And I'm going to put a record scratch there because we have to take another mic diversion and talk a little bit about history. So who was here when I taught on good works, and I kind of gave that history lesson in the beginning of, you know, how we got to this? And one of the things I'd mentioned was that the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, which was formed in 1788, when they adopted the Westminster Confession, of Faith, with minor revisions. Well, chapter 23, section 3 is one of those revisions. And this is specifically where all that comes into play. So what we have here is what's common between the original confession from 1646 and the 1789 revised confession. And it's important to note that while the Confession of Faith is considered a venerable document, it is not infallible. And even, the Westminster Divines themselves, in chapter 1, section 10, they say the supreme judge by which all, and I had to annotate this a little bit, by which all decrees of councils, opinions of ancient writers, doctrines of men, are to be examined, and in whose sentence we are to rest, can be no other than but the Holy Spirit speaking in the Scripture. So they themselves knew that while this was an important document, and they knew that they were doing important work, they also knew that this was not infallible. And it was because of that this revision was made to this chapter and section. So I apologize for the text, but there's a lot to get on here. So I'll just try to read through what was on 1646, and you guys have the 1789 version in front of you, so I'm not going to bother reading all of that. But so the 1646 original version, starts off with blah, 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 kingdom of heaven, yet he hath authority, and it is his duty to take order, that unity and peace be preserved in the church, that the truth of God be kept pure and entire, that all blasphemies and heresies be suppressed, all corruptions and abuses in worship and discipline prevented or reformed, and all the ordinances of God duly settled, administered, and observed, for the better effecting whereof he hath power to call synods, to be present in them, and to provide that whatsoever is transacted in them be according to the mind of God. So that's a lot to take in, so I'm going to kind of give you the highlights of it. So the original version is basically saying that while the state could not assume the administration of the word, the sacraments, or power of the keys to the kingdom, so it clearly says that in the first section, and that's the part that's common between the original and what we ascribe to. It said that it was the state's responsibility to suppress heresy, to prevent or reform corrupt worship, etc., which seems to me like a little bit of a contradiction. So we're saying that the state cannot have the keys to the kingdom, but the state must be somehow responsible for the keys to the kingdom. Right? So I don't think there's any way to look at that other than to say, well, it certainly feels like a contradiction. And we probably have to look at that, and we can understand that's why it was revised the way that it was. So, if you thought that magistrate was a good word, I've got two really good ones for you. So there's the establishmentarianism point of view and the disestablishmentarianism point of view. So the establishmentarianism, I can't even say that myself, is what we see on the left. And really this comes from, again, the historical perspective that we have to understand from when the confession was written. So in 1646, England was an establishmentarianism state, right? So there was an established religion. Well, it was de facto establishmentarianism, I should say. It wasn't actually written into their constitution yet. It is now. But by that, the Church of England was the established faith by the state. It was the faith that the people were prescribed to have. Now, throughout the history of England, that went back and forth. Bloody Mary comes in and she says, nope, it's now Catholicism. Then it goes back. And like I said, now it is formally the Anglican Church is the established Church of England. But so for the divines, at the time that the confession was written, it was natural for the state to have the role that they did. It was natural for the state to be involved in the church. And that's why the original version of this section was written the way that it was. And the idea of established religions is not something new. It existed for many, many years, and there's still many countries today that are establishmentarian in the way that they operate. Can anybody think of any, perhaps? Pardon? Russia, yes. So Russia would be considered a de facto establishmentarian church, but the Russian Orthodox Church is the church established by the state, and Putin has some very weird involvement with the church because of the way that it has been established in that country. There's a number of Middle Eastern countries where Islam is the established religion, right? China, atheism is actually the established religion, if you want to call it that. Vatican City, obviously Roman Catholic Church is the established religion. So an established religion is not something new. But why might the American church have adopted the language that it did in their section? Go ahead, Harry.
Is freedom of religion, in other words, to practice your faith without the interference, or how should I put it, without a top-down enforcement of a specific church or faith. Now, where it goes wrong today is the view is freedom from religion.
Right.
When God's perspective is basically the government is to keep their mitts out of the church. But it doesn't mean that they should be antagonistic to the church. In fact, God does not want them to be antagonistic to the church, but to support it versus discourage it.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, let's look back to history even predating the colonial area. So the Puritans who first came over here, why did they come over here? Because they were being oppressed by the churches in Europe, right? They were being told that the way that you are practicing is not right with us, and that's why they fled. So their lived experience of most of the continental people and the number of established churches was that a lot of really bad things can happen when we let the government get involved in the church. And so when they revised this chapter of the Confession, they essentially said, we will be disestablishmentarian in our view, meaning that there should be no established religion by the government. The government should not have its role in anything with the church. Now, that's not to say, as Harry pointed out, that the government should be antagonistic. In fact, this section of the Confession, especially the revised version, calls out and says that the government should be doing everything to protect churches. Not that it should be picking favorites, but it is the government's role, again, with that the authority and the power of the sword, to protect churches from persecution, but not to be picking churches. And I'm running really short on time, so I'm just going to start hurrying this up. All right. So, yeah, again, what do we get out of Section 3 here? So, government cannot hold the keys to the kingdom. The government is bound to protect the church. There can be no preference given to any religion by the government. The church, not the government, is responsible for religious discipline of professing members. And if I had more time, I could go into a number of examples where actually more and more that's getting encroached even today. The government is bound to protect all citizens regardless of religious preference, and the government cannot interfere with church assembly. And all of those points have clear biblical basis. All right, so what is our duty to the civil magistrate? From 1 Timothy, we can get that it's our job to pray for the government. From 1 Peter, we can get that it's our job to submit to the government. From Romans, again, that chapter which is a proof text throughout all of the section, is that we have to trust that God has dominion over these governments. And then from Mark 10, we get what the Christian model of true servant leadership is. So, when we look at each of these and how it relates to this chapter of the Confession, it gets to the heart of what our interpersonal relationship with the government is. So we must pray for them. Clearly, it's drawn out in here. We must honor the government, made very clear, and we must pay taxes, if for nothing else, then out of conscience. So those three things are made abundantly clear in this part of the Confession. It also says that religious differences or the fact that you may be a church leader do not negate the God-given authority of our government over us or change our requirement to be obedient to the government. Now there's a caveat: unless government laws or rulings are in discord with the rule or the law of God. So in that case, certainly, I think we are, going back to some of the earlier things that we've said, in those cases we are called to be disobedient to the government, honestly, if the government is doing things that are against God's law. And we can certainly look to some biblical examples of that too, right? The midwives hiding the babies from Pharaoh. Clear disobedience to the government that God had placed over them, but they were saving the lives of innocents. Not to get too political, but we can even look back to the church's response to COVID. There was a whole bunch of prayer and discussion about how we should be responding to COVID and how we can best adhere to this tenet of the confession. And I think our church specifically did a pretty good job of that. Absolutely, yes. Abortion specifically falls under this as well. You're right. And then the very last part of the confession there, where it's talking about much less hath the Pope any power and jurisdiction over them and their dominions. This is just one more additional rebuke of the Roman Catholic Church, as there have been many throughout the confession. And the reason for this, again, has some historical basis. So, in many Catholic-dominant countries during the time, and actually it still exists today, it was not uncommon for the clergy, who calls ecclesiastical persons there, so essentially church clergy or officers, to have some type of elevated civil status. You may have heard the anecdote of the Irish cop pulling over somebody who was speeding only to find out that it was this priest and he let him go, right? Those types of things. So that was a huge thing that was going on that the Westminster Divines were aware of and saw, and they wanted to put it out there that shouldn't exist. The second evil, which they're railing against here, is that, and this technically is still the case, is the claim of the Pope of Rome to have civil authority. So in Vatican City specifically, the Pope absolutely has civil authority. That's written in their law. But the Pope at the time and prior to this was also claiming to have civil authority that he did not have. So, the popes had disposed of many kings in the past. They had granted clemency or leniency to people who were guilty of some type of crime, right? And the Westminster Divine said, no, does not have civil authority. He cannot claim civil authority, and we are codifying it here. One thing I do want to talk about too, again, getting to the idea of priests with, or I should say ecclesiastical persons with elevated civil authority. So, in my research and preparing for this, I was reading about the sex scandal in the Catholic Church and how that has gone on and played out. Italy, as a country, is one of those places where, as you can understand, Rome being in Italy, there is unwritten civil excellence granted. That's not the right word. Anyway, priests are elevated in an unwritten way. It's just kind of de facto what happens. And specifically, since 2000, over 300 priests in Italy have been accused of sexual abuse. Of those accusations, only 140 were investigated, and only 5 priests ended up going to jail. So, just one example of how allowing the clergy to have elevated civil authority and not being able to be held accountable civilly is not a good thing, right? All right, I'm out of time, actually passed out of time, so I'm just going to review what we have here. So, in summary, what we learned from chapter 23 today: civil magistrates are put in place by God under the authority of Christ and are granted authority to rule over us. We may fulfill a vocation to serve in the government, including in the military. It is the duty of the government to protect the free exercise of religion, and our duty to respect the lawful acts of the government that do not go against God's law. And then we must pray for and honor our civil leaders. And by the way, the Pope in Rome has no civil authority. So, and that is all I have for you today. If there's any questions, we can probably take one or two, and the Sunday school teachers can come beat me up later. Go ahead, Tony. Yes, absolutely. And again, I think that goes to the idea of when the government is overreaching, doing things that are not biblical. So, when we look at the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the civil disobedience that happened, certainly in line with that. And there's legal and biblical reasons for that, but absolutely, civil disobedience is permitted. Yes. Anything else? Absolutely, yes. Yeah. So the question was, the large assemblies, large numbers of people in civil disobedience. Yes, that is absolutely permitted under this. Go ahead.
Up there, you said, granted authority to rule over us. The people we elect are servants to carry out the Constitution of the United States, and they are also under that law.
Yes, yeah. So
and they can be arrested and put in jail.
They can. So it is not an authoritarian rule, and they are not exempt from law in that. Yes, but they are placed over us by God is the important takeaway from that. All right. Well, thank you guys. Have a great day.